They tested the skull, not once, not twice, and every time, the result came back the same. It wasn't his. This skull had been displayed, studied, and believed for decades to belong to Mozart, one of the greatest composers in history. Scientists had examined it, researchers had written about it, museums had presented it to visitors as a genuine artifact of the man who gave the world symphonies, operas, and melodies that still haunt us 3 centuries later. But science said otherwise. So here's the question that changes everything. If this wasn't Mozart, then whose skull was it? To understand why this discovery shook the world of history and science, you first have to understand who Mozart was, and why his remains should have been one of the most carefully preserved things in all of human civilization. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in Salzburg in 1756. By the time he was 5 years old, he was composing music. By 6, he was performing for royalty across Europe. By the time most children were learning to read, Mozart had already written pieces that professional musicians struggled to play. He was not just talented. He was something that history rarely produces. A mind so far ahead of its time that even other geniuses stood in silence when he played. By his 20s, his name was known from London to Prague. Emperors invited him to perform. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared. He wrote over 600 works, symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music, in a life that lasted less than 4 decades. Because Mozart died at 35, December 5th, 1791, Vienna. The cause of death was recorded vaguely. Severe miliary fever, the documents said, a term that meant almost nothing then, and explains even less now. Some historians believe it was rheumatic fever. Others point to kidney disease. A few have suggested something far darker, that Mozart was poisoned, though no solid evidence has ever confirmed it. What we know is this. In the span of 2 weeks, one of the greatest minds in human history was gone. And then something strange happened. He was buried in a common grave, no marble monument, no private tomb, no ceremony worthy of a man who had performed for the crowned heads of Europe. Just a wooden coffin lowered into a pit at the St. Mark's Cemetery in Vienna, alongside the bodies of strangers. This was not unusual for the time. Common graves were standard practice for most of the population, and even respected citizens were often buried this way. But the result was devastating for history. There was no marked tomb, no confirmed location, no way to ever return and say, "Here he is." Mozart was buried, and then, in every physical sense, he vanished. For decades, this bothered people. You cannot simply lose Mozart, the world's most celebrated composer, buried like an afterthought, with no stone bearing his name, no landmark, no proof of where exactly his body had been placed. The city of Vienna eventually erected memorials. Museums gathered his manuscripts, his instruments, his letters, but the body, the actual physical remains of the man, remained a mystery wrapped in a shallow, unmarked grave. Then, in the early 19th century, a story emerged. A gravedigger at St. Mark's Cemetery claimed that he had been present at Mozart's burial. He said that after the funeral, when the cemetery workers returned to begin work, he had taken something from the grave, a skull. He had kept it, hidden it, brought it home. And for years, it passed through hands, from one person to the next, down through the decades, each new owner repeating the same story. This is Mozart's skull. This was taken from his grave. This is him. By the late 1800s, the skull had made its way to the Mozarteum Foundation in Salzburg, the institution dedicated to preserving the composer's legacy. It was placed in a glass case, studied by phrenologists who measured its curves and declared it consistent with genius, examined by anatomists who confirmed it could plausibly belong to a man of Mozart's age at death. For generations, visitors came to Salzburg and stood before that glass case and believed they were looking at something sacred, a piece of history, the last physical trace of the man who wrote The Magic Flute, Don Giovanni, the Requiem. They were looking at a skull. They just didn't know yet that it was the wrong one. In the early 2000s, scientists decided to settle the question once and for all. DNA testing had become sophisticated enough to do what previous generations could only dream of. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down through the maternal line, highly stable over generations, could be extracted from bone and compared between individuals who shared a common ancestor. If the skull truly belonged to Mozart, its DNA should match, at least partially, the DNA of his known relatives. The team was careful, methodical. They extracted DNA from the skull and from the remains of individuals believed to be related to Mozart through the maternal line. Specifically, remains identified as belonging to his grandmother and his niece, women who would have shared the same mitochondrial lineage as Mozart himself. The scientists ran the tests, then they ran them again. The results came back, and they were not what anyone expected. The DNA from the skull did not match the DNA from the supposed relatives, not even close. The skull was genetically unrelated to the individuals who should have been its closest biological connections. Whatever that skull was, whoever it had belonged to in life, it was not Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The tests were repeated, scrutinized, published. Other researchers examined the methodology. The conclusion held. The skull in the glass case in Salzburg was not Mozart's skull. Let that sink in for a moment. This object had been presented to the public as genuine for over a century. Scientists had studied it. Writers had written about it. The Mozarteum had displayed it as part of its collection. Visitors had stood before it with something close to reverence. It had been referenced in books, documentaries, academic papers, and it was not his. So, what exactly had everyone been looking at? The honest answer is, we don't know. But there are several theories, and each one is more unsettling than the last. The first and most straightforward explanation is that the gravedigger's story was simply wrong. Not a lie, necessarily, but a mistake. Common graves in 18th century Vienna contained many bodies. They were not neatly organized. Over time, remains shifted, settled, mingled. A gravedigger who returned days or weeks after Mozart's burial may have genuinely believed he was taking Mozart's skull. He had no way to verify it. There were no labels on the bones. He took a skull from the general area, and the story grew from there. The second possibility is more deliberate. The story of the skull, how it was taken, preserved, and passed down, may have been embellished over time, each retelling adding detail and certainty that the original account didn't contain. By the time it reached the Mozarteum, it had become a provenance so convincing that no one thought to question it seriously. The skull may have belonged to anyone, a neighbor, a stranger, someone buried near Mozart who has no name in any historical record. The third possibility involves the DNA test itself. Some researchers have pointed out a significant complication. The remains used as a comparison, the grandmother and the niece, were themselves not definitively confirmed. Their identification relied on historical records and grave markers that are no older than the city's burial documentation, which was itself imperfect. If the comparison remains were misidentified, the DNA mismatch might not prove the skull is wrong. It might simply reflect uncertainty on both sides of the equation. And then there is the fourth possibility, the one that no amount of scientific testing can resolve. Mozart's grave was disturbed. Cemetery records show that plots were reused in the decades following his burial. Bones were moved, some were discarded, some were relocated without documentation. By the time anyone thought to search carefully for Mozart's remains, the grave may have already been altered beyond recognition. Each of these theories is possible. None of them is proven. Here is what the DNA testing ultimately confirmed, regardless of which explanation is correct. Mozart has no verified grave. He has no confirmed remains. In every physical, biological, traceable sense, one of the most famous human beings who ever lived has simply vanished from the earth. Think about what that means. We have the remains of Egyptian pharaohs who died 3,000 years ago. We have the bones of Richard III, found beneath a parking lot in Leicester, identified by DNA in 2012. We have confirmed remains of Roman emperors, medieval kings, Renaissance artists. History has preserved the physical traces of countless figures far older and far less documented than Mozart. But Mozart, a man who died in 1791 in a major European capital, surrounded by a society that kept written records, who was mourned publicly, whose death was documented. Mozart has no body, not a bone, not a tooth, nothing. And this brings us to something deeper than one misidentified skull. History is not a photograph. It is not a perfect recording of what happened. It is a collection of stories, documents, objects, and testimonies, all of them filtered through human error, human ambition, human belief. And sometimes those stories accumulate enough weight that they begin to feel like facts. People stop asking questions. The skull is in the museum. The label says Mozart. The visitors believe. This is how history works. Objects become evidence before they are verified. Stories become accepted before they are tested. And once something has been believed for long enough, questioning it feels almost rude, almost disrespectful to the generations who came before and didn't question it either. But science doesn't care about tradition. Science ran the test. The test said no. And suddenly, everything everyone thought they knew about this particular piece of history was wrong. How many other cases are there like this? How many skulls, relics, artifacts, and remains sit in museums and archives, labeled with confident certainty, never subjected to the scrutiny that might overturn them? How many historical narratives rest on a foundation that has never been tested? Not because the test is impossible, but because no one thought to run it. The Mozart skull is not a unique failure of history. It is a window into how history works when no one is watching carefully enough. Return to the skull, a real object, solid, tangible. You could hold it in your hands. It has weight and texture and the unmistakable shape of a human being who once existed. For over a century, people touched it, measured it, photographed it, wrote about it, and displayed it with pride. It was completely wrong, not slightly wrong, not ambiguous, wrong in a way that the most basic modern analysis could detect. If anyone had run this test 100 years ago, if the technology had existed, the story of Mozart's skull would have ended before it began. But the technology didn't exist, and so the story grew, and the belief hardened, and the skull sat in its case, looking back at everyone who came to look at it. And it was never his. They tested the skull, and it wasn't Mozart, which means one of the greatest minds in history has no face, no bones, no grave, just music, and a mystery we still haven't solved. Because somewhere out there, beneath a city that has been rebuilt and repaved and renovated over 2.5 centuries, the actual remains of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart may still exist, unmarked, unrecognized, mixed in with the bones of people whose names were never written down. Or they may be gone entirely, scattered, lost to the same indifferent passage of time that swallows most of human history without leaving a trace. We don't know, we may never know. And there is something almost fitting about that, something that Mozart himself might have recognized, in that dark, ironic way that genius sometimes understands its own fate. He wrote music that was supposed to outlast him, and it did. Every note survives, every phrase, every silence between the phrases, but the man himself, gone. As if he was only ever here in sound,